Welcome to Pipe Dream, the podcast for B2B marketers, founders, and go-to-market leaders navigating the post-AI marketing landscape. My name is Jason Bradwell. Each week, we profile the companies and individuals that have stopped competing on information and started building media that actually differentiates. Today's guest sits at the intersection of everything we talk about on this show. David Rowlands is head of product at B2B Marketing and Propolis, where he's helping transform what was essentially a magazine and events business into a community-led subscription media model. As the former editor and head of content, David shaped much of the B2B marketing narrative through hundreds of articles, reports, and benchmarks, and now he's turned that editorial expertise into actual products. Propolis, the subscription home for B2B marketers that combines expert advisory and private community, and the Propolis Community Index, a real-time performance dashboard built from anonymized member data. He's also the driving force behind the B2B Marketing podcast, where he sits down with CMOs from brands like Aon, Canon, Dentsu to unpack the exact questions that we explore here on Pipe Dream. How to prove marketing's commercial impact, how to navigate AI, what buying committees actually care about. In other words, David has watched B2B marketing evolve from creating helpful content to building something AI can't replicate. Proprietary data, gated expertise, and genuine community. David, welcome to Pipe Dream.
Thank you very much, Jason. What an introduction. I'm blushing already. A pleasure to be here. And hopefully I can live up to that introduction.
I'm sure you can, because it is your story and I wrote it as such. Why don't, before we get into the questions, you tell us a little bit about how you got to where you are today. Just kind of give us the 60-second cliff notes of where you began and how you've ended up working at B2B Marketing and Propolis.
Sure. I mean, I started my career at a business called Palladian Publications in Farnham in Surrey. They essentially run a number of magazines for in the engineering and oil and gas space. And I started as an editorial assistant, moved my way up to editor. And then right at the beginning of COVID, I moved to B2B Marketing. And you can imagine at the time, I'd handed my notice in at my last place, and there was suddenly this kind of moment of, oh God, was this a sensible move? The world felt like it was ending, but it all worked well in the end at B2B Marketing. So that's the overview, and slowly sort of changed from editor into product, although I'm still sort of involved in reports, and I've sort of across all bases now in B2B.
Awesome. That's great. B2B Marketing, the publication is just a kind of like bastion of expertise and insights that I know the entire industry, looks to. It must be really exciting and exhilarating to be really a kind of like the epicenter of, reporting on the innovation that's happening in the industry. It's a business that has seen a lot of change, right? It's been around for years. And from what I understand, since you arrived, it started to kind of move into and transform itself into a kind of subscription-based model, which is, very innovative and really kind of like build out Propolis at the center of all of that. And so that's like a massive pivot from just let's create a load of editorial content and hope people read it to like, let's build a community that people ultimately want to feel like part of. What was the moment that you and B2B Marketing kind of realized this whole model, this whole media model wasn't going to work anymore necessarily or work as well? And what ultimately, walk us through the bet that you made in order to replace it?
No, it's a great question. I think, if you look at how B2B marketing started, it was in the early 2000s as a print magazine, and we reported on the latest news, the greatest campaigns, Q&As with leaders in B2B. And, quite quickly that turned into events, which turned into full-on conferences, turned into an awards program, a very sort of typical journey that lots of those in the media go through. And through that, what we started to do is build a sort of latent community. We would meet leaders at our events. We would, we'd interview them for reports or articles, and we started building this group of leaders that we regularly interacted with, and people would make their connections on the side. And eventually, after a few years of doing that, we launched something called the Leaders Program. Essentially, what that was a series of roundtables throughout the year. including the Leaders Forum, which still exists. And that is a sort of large scale event exclusively for B2B marketing leaders, so CMOs, directors, and so on. And really what these events are about is bringing that community together and giving them a space to share and learn from one another. All that being said, that was quite it was a fairly small part of the business at the time. Most of our business was the digital media side of things, and then obviously the events as well. What changed that was, perhaps unsurprisingly, was the pandemic. Effectively, overnight, our event side of the business was put on indefinite hold. We didn't know if those conferences were going to be coming back in a month, 2 months, 3 months, a year, 2 years, ever. No one really knew what was happening in that space. And obviously, as a business, we needed to pivot. At the same time as all of that, what happened is because of the emergence of digital media, publishing online suddenly became a lot easier. There wasn't that same barrier to entry, and anyone could have a blog, anyone could write a report, anyone could, share their opinion online. And what that really led to, we feel, is a lack of trust, a lack of knowledge around who to believe, who not to believe. And in a time like the pandemic, when it felt like the whole industry was being churned up overnight, people really wanted a place where they could get clear answers and learn from their peers and just feel like they weren't alone in that respect. And so really that's how Propolis was born. It was taking that leaders program, formalizing it into something more substantial and giving leaders a place to learn from one another and have that sort of face-to-face contact, albeit by video call at the beginning, and a place where they could get access to really high value content that they knew could be trusted, as opposed to the influx of blogs and LinkedIn posts. So yeah, that was the bet we took. It was about transitioning in a low trust world into a model where people had a place where they could get reliable information and have a trusted network of people to rely on.
That's awesome. What I love about talking to you and looking to B2B marketing and Propolis is, as a media organization, you really can write the playbook that other B2B companies can look to when developing out their own media strategies. Like, we've all heard the term, you should all, as a B2B vendor or service provider, you should think like a media company. And I don't necessarily think that means that every vendor out there needs to completely reorient their business in order to literally become a media company. But I think some of the practices that you spoke about there, in regards to kind of how do we pivot, events into, creating a hub that our customers can be a part of, both digital and then when available back into IRL is really interesting. And I think, so there are a lot of other projects that you currently work on over at Propolis that I'd like to dive into a little bit more to kind of start to unpack what does owned media look like over there at Propolis. Then the next thing is, the Propolis Community Index. Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about what it is, and then we can talk a little bit about, why it exists and the kind of benefits that it provides to you.
Well, actually, let's start with how it came about. So on Propolis, on the hub, we have a feature called Discussions. Essentially, this is a digital forum where people can ask questions, jump into conversations about a certain topic, whatever it may be. And very, very early on in launching Propolis, which was at the very beginning of 2021, we were seeing a lot of questions around a need for metrics. So how big are people's budgets? Are they going up? Are they going down? Where are you spending? What's working, what's not working? And effectively there was, lots of this information is available on the internet. It's not to say the index is the only place you can get this information, but it's scattergun and it's deep in page 97 of a PDF, or it's right at the bottom of a page from, potentially an agency. And so having one place where you could have, again, a reliable source for that information was something our members really needed. So that was the impetus behind creating it. In terms of what it actually is, essentially, it is a live dashboard that Propolis members can access, and it's fed by data submitted by members, and then supplemented by additional data when necessary from a research partner. And this is submitted via very lengthy, intense, quite serious surveys. But the output is a dashboard where you can filter by technology or by manufacturing, and you can see the trends over time in terms of what's happening to team size and budget and so on. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's what the index is, and we are into our third year of having it now. And it just becomes more and more valuable as you get the sort of trend data year on year.
Yeah. And for Propolis and B2B marketing, like what is the role that the index plays? Like, is it a service to the community that plays a role in retention? Is it more of an acquisition channel? Is it both, of the above? Like, how do you look at it strategically in terms of the outcomes that the community index should be driving for you?
Yeah, no, it's both. First of all, it's a great way to, we can chop up parts of the data, turn that into reports and content, sessions and events to talk about, a given trend in the industry. So it helps, build awareness around some of the value Propolis can bring, and it helps kickstart some really useful conversations for the sales team. So there's definitely that element to it, but primarily it is it's a members only tool, which they use in their hopefully in their sort of day-to-day role to bring information into board meetings and, make decisions more confidently because it's grounded in real data. So yeah, it serves a multiple purposes, but that's essentially what we're doing with it.
That's awesome. And I think this is like an untapped opportunity for a lot of brands who are probably sitting on their own mountains of data or are in a position to acquire proprietary data and then find ways of repackaging that to service their target customers and ultimately their audience and their community. For instance, it reminds me of my last in-house role. I worked for a tech vendor that was plugged into the broadcast media sector. And, we worked with some of the biggest names of broadcast media, the BBC and sports leagues and teams and federations, and did a multitude of different things because we were a professional services firm. And I always refer to us as like, the town square of the industry, in that we were plugged into all of these different businesses that were coming to us, lifting the hood on how they were running their businesses, how they were thinking about their businesses, where they were making investments. No one else had access to that kind of level of information, right? Like not even media outlets. And, we would often find ways of course, like anonymizing and aggregating that data, but ultimately packaging it in a way that we could use to get in front of our prospective clients and ultimately, drive awareness and attention. And so I think maybe you can talk to a little bit about this, like a takeaway for people listening to this episode is, think about your own data, think about what do you have access to that no one else has access to in terms of the information that they can't just prompt their way to gaining access to in something like ChatGPT. And how do you package that up and reservice it to your community to drive awareness? I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. I think, ultimately we launched the Propolis Index in I don't want to say a pre-AI world, because people say, oh, AI is not new, it's been here for decades, and fair enough. But in terms of the popular sort of consciousness around AI, we launched the index either right when that was starting or just before. So it wasn't really on our roadmap at the time. Call it great strategic foresight or luck or serendipity. I'll say it was strategic foresight. Why not? It actually has become even more valuable for us than when we first launched it, because of the reasons you say. It's the having that data that no one else owns, that isn't available via a chatbot. Now, admittedly, we use snippets of that information in reports and so on. So some of it will be effectively available via a chatbot, but only the smallest percentage of it. And I think there is an important balance to strike there with content, because on the one hand, you want eyes on your business. You want people to find you. And the way people are going to find you now, and more so in the future, is via chatbots like ChatGPT or Gemini. At the same time, you don't want to give everything away. Otherwise, you haven't got anything to differentiate yourself.
You've segued us nicely into my next point, which is, the types of content that you produce and, what should you be putting where? I mean, obviously, you've kind of come up as an editor, as a head of content, and you've spent years creating like helpful content that AI is increasingly starting to commoditize. And I say you, kind of like you, the individual, but also you, like Propolis and B2B marketing. I'd be curious to dig into like, how has your own thinking evolved and how is it evolving about what content is actually for? So like when B2B marketing is deciding like what to publish, or Propolis is deciding what to publish, what framework are you using to distinguish between content that's like feeding the AI models and content that's like genuinely valuable and proprietary to your business?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I think, my view a couple of years ago when I first sort of used ChatGPT was, I think AI was essentially going to help people pump out a lot more average content at scale, flooding the internet with essentially quite bland narratives, or fairly repetitive ideas. Now, that was quite a sort of pessimistic view of things, but equally, when you only have to go on LinkedIn to see I'm not far off, depending on who you follow. And I think really there's an opportunity with people creating content to stand out from that sea of blandness and create really rich, useful, genuinely valuable content. So I don't think the need to create valuable content has gone away in any way, shape or form. If anything, I actually think it's more important than ever, because there's so much more content out there that to stand out, you really have to have something quite special. At the same time, if you're creating your own chatbot, which many businesses are, particularly in the media space, you need to make sure that the content that is feeding that is valuable as well. Otherwise, the output of your bot isn't going to be noticeably different from a ChatGPT. And if it's not noticeably different, there's not really any value in it. How we use content has changed. We still create plenty of content in, reports, webinars, quite traditional formats now, but they still work. They still help get a message out there. There's still a demand for it. But equally, everything we create, we're looking through the eyes of how will this ensure that we have a more powerful proprietary data set that we can protect at all times. So the good news is that content is still valuable. It's more important than ever. I think this worry about all editors being replaced with robots, which is certainly the fear I had a couple of years ago, I don't think is going to materialize. It's just an evolution more than anything else.
Yeah, and I think we're also kind of on the kind of like bell curve of like AI adoption. I think we are starting to kind of come in some ways like around the other side of it, in that you're seeing all the time, right, like these like tech vendors who laid off 15,000 members of staff at the end of 2024, beginning of 2025, saying we're going to replace everyone with like AI, who are now having to go back out there and like rehire these people because they're realizing the limitations that the technology provides. I feel it's like the same way with content, and audience building and community building. And like, yes, when it comes to like transactional, like really information heavy and information led like content, that is not the place to kind of compete in anymore. But like creating the things that are proprietary, that you can own and like deliver real value to your customers with, because it's not something that they can get out of a ChatGPT bot. I think people are starting to understand that these LLMs aren't the answers to every single problem, right? Like there is value in kind of looking a bit further afield and looking for the people like B2B Marketing and Propolis, who are putting in the hard yards to actually create something that is distinctive and differentiated. I want to talk a little bit more about the kind of community element of Propolis, because I know that's really interesting to a lot of our listeners. Community-led marketing is talked about a lot. I think, the perception of it is like, let's start a Slack channel, send out a bunch of invites, people will join. Great, we've now got a community. Propolis isn't just a Slack channel or like a LinkedIn group or anything. It's this paid subscription model. There's a ton of stuff going on there. There's like advisory, there's skills building, you've got the in-person events, etc. That's a lot of infrastructure, and I think a lot of B2B companies would look at that and be like, that is a lot more than just a Slack channel. It's probably a little bit too complicated for us. What's the like business model logic for you that makes Propolis worth building all of that versus just continuing to pump out more webinars, more content, and run these events?
Yeah, no, yeah, sure. It's a really interesting one. I think when we launched Propolis, the emphasis was on the community and the content. It was, you have access to this safe space, roundtables, and here's, exclusive proprietary reports. That was, we did other things as well, but the two core things we did were that. At the same time, what we had then and we still have are our big conferences and our awards programs. So B2B Ignite, which is our flagship conference, takes place every summer in London. The ABM conference that obviously focuses on ABM. We had all of these events as well, but they weren't actually part of Propolis. They existed in their own right. And I think what we soon realized is that the community aspect of Propolis, though valuable, it's a tough sell, frankly. It's really hard because people know that, I can see the value in coming to a roundtable and learning from my peers, and I can see the value of having access to these industry reports. But it's hard, especially in an environment where there's a lot of scrutiny over every penny that a marketer spends. It's hard to make that business case in terms of, if I attend 4 roundtables, this will convert into my knowledge going up X%, and that will convert it into et cetera, et cetera. It's really hard to make that case. So it wasn't necessarily a case of rebuilding all this infrastructure from the ground up. In many ways, it was actually about linking all of that infrastructure together and putting Propolis at the heart of it. So what I mean by that is, at Ignite, for example, last year we used the opening keynote sessions to, make our big stance on what was happening in the industry and what we felt marketers needed to do. We do that and share that information and that insight with all our attendees. But ultimately, if people want to know more, then it's a case of joining Propolis. It's a case of having richer discussions at roundtables and so on, but also maybe getting hands-on support from our experts. We have a whole program around how we can help marketers achieve their goals. So community is really valuable. I think the Slack channel approach or the WhatsApp group approach, they're brilliant. They really do work. But I think when you are trying to build something that really engages enterprise businesses at scale and builds a really strong network of companies in your membership, I think you have to provide more. You can listen and let people share what their challenges are and what they need help with. But if you don't then give them a vehicle to achieve those things, i.e. through our Propolis experts or through content or whatever it may be, or training, I think people are missing an opportunity. So community is important, but it's also a place to build on top other things.
If I'm understanding correctly, it's like, I think, people think about community and like wanting to build a community, and they almost like start with the platform first, like what is the domain or the location that we are going to like bring these people together, usually like digitally. And like what you're saying is that it almost went the other way around for Propolis, which was you were investing obviously a lot in content through B2B marketing, the publication, you were putting on these events, you were creating these reports. And once you built like this critical mass of value, only then did you say, okay, well, like how do we now actually kind of package this under the umbrella, or parts of this under the umbrella that is Propolis, right? And like have that then become the community play. Am I understanding that correctly in terms of like the timeline?
Yeah, that's essentially right. And I think, ultimately one of the difficulties is that we had, and this is something we really had to spend a lot of time working on, is that we have a huge amount of value that we can bring in terms of a conference session might help someone achieve a certain aim. A training course might help with another aim. This blog on page 207 of the website might help with another aim. We had all of these kind of disconnected areas that were all helpful in their own right. But if you're a marketer, actually kind of knowing where to start, what questions you should even be asking yourself, it's quite a lot to digest and make sense of. So it wasn't necessarily a case of let's build Propolis and create 200 new products that are going to meet everyone's problems. It was almost a case of let's build Propolis and help people go on a journey through all these different things that help them achieve their ultimate aim. So it's quite complicated, but you're basically right about how it works and how it started.